Hello, everybody. Today we're going to be talking about blockchains and how these are going to transform the cannabis industry and why we're using them with our StrainSEEK product offering. Blockchains present tremendous amount of opportunity to the field, and in order for you to really, I think, understand blockchains, you have to suspend some of your identity politics. You have to put all that aside and ask yourself, largely identity politics is arguing over what a centralized a piece of power should do. And with blockchains, you have to stop and ask, do you need it anymore? Do you need a centralized command and control center governing this part of the economy? Or can it be made obsolete just like monarchs were made obsolete hundreds of years ago? So suspend all of your prior thinkings on socioeconomics if you can for just a brief moment and try to understand the magnitude and the gravity of what this technology can do for people. And it'll be much easier for you to, I think, to understand and grapple with what's going on here. So what is Bitcoin? Well, I view things through a biological lens, and I view Bitcoin as basically an internet immune response. It's an immune response to something that's evolved over the growth of the internet. The growth of the internet has, over time, created very large centralized power brokers in the internet that control information. And nothing's more true about that when it comes to the actual banking system. We have large centralized databases now that are dangerous by design. Okay, they are what we call honeypots for hackers because they collect large amounts of personal identification information, credit card information, zip codes, and social security numbers, all of these things which contribute to over $40 billion in credit card theft every year. And of course, digital identity theft is happening at record paces and creates a tremendous amount of distraction and waste in the economy. Much of this is because there are economic incentives to centralize this information, and Bitcoin is changing that. It's creating an economic incentive to decentralize information, and by doing so, a currency has emerged out of this interesting technology. Okay, so this honeypot problem is critical to resolve in order for us to move money around the internet. If we cannot be certain of the trust of where data stays or stored, we can never be trusting a global internet ledger, let's say. All right. So Bitcoin solves this problem by making a global ledger, but creating a competition for people to keep it alive and accurate all throughout the globe. The other key thing that it does is it solves something that's known as a digital or a double spend problem. Just like with internet music, it's easy to copy internet music over and over again. Well, how are we going to make digital money if it's easy to copy it? If it can be copied over and over again, it can be subject to attack like the Federal Reserve, which has been printing boatloads of money for the last 5 years, and that only leads to hyperinflation and very dangerous economic circumstances, and fundamentally robs the middle class and makes people poorer and enriches folks that are really close to the printing press. Okay, so we can't have that. In order to have a good currency, you need to have a regulated or regulated by code issuance, if you will. And that's what Bitcoin is. Built into the program, it's going to emit over 21 million Bitcoins as rewards for people who mine them. All right, we're already at 16 million of these Bitcoins, which is why the price is going up exponentially, because we're reaching a scarcity part of the printing process. But the printing process won't complete itself until 2140. Okay, and at that point, there will be transaction fees that will keep miners incentivized to keep mining this. So, what are miners? You have to understand why do miners mine, and the reason miners mine is because Bitcoin is a competition for computers to solve problems and the proof of those problems weave a lot of cryptographic safety into the ledger, if you will. And we'll touch on that momentarily. But you also have to step back a little bit more globally and realize what this has become. Ever since 2009, it's been the best performing currency globally for ever since its existence, and it's now the largest computer network in the world. It's 1,000 times larger than the top 500 supercomputers combined, and that number is probably old. It seems to keep going up every year. In terms of the number of computers that are turning to this, you'll see the network is measured in petahashes and exahashes, and more of the computers are turning their attention to solving this problem because there are very interesting economic circumstances to be had from this. What you will find in this map are some interesting nodes in Iceland and in China, and these are places where energy is cheap because energy is really the core ingredient behind Bitcoin mining, and this is what drives most of the cost. So this has created a very interesting symbiotic relationship that people have to keep their eye on, that power plants that oftentimes would have to overproduce energy to match demand cycles because you can't actually predict the future. You can't, during surge times, produce perfect synchrony number of electrons to your demand cycle. You have to always overproduce energy according to what you think your demand is going to be, and a lot of times that energy is wasted in heat and off-gassed into the environment. Well, Bitcoin miners have found a nice symbiotic home with many power plants, in which case they can return some of that wasted energy and thread it through ASIC cards to mine Bitcoins and effectively produce a form of digital cash. So this is waste getting turned into internet security. And this symbiotic relationship with our energy sector and the internet economy is creating the largest trusted network of information in the world. All right. So this is an evolutionary force we've never seen before, and the rate at which it's growing is quite hyperbolic. It is an exponential growth pattern that we're seeing in Bitcoin, and we see no signs of this stopping. Now, you have to consider, if you're a hacker, how are you going to attack this thing, right? There's 10,000 nodes around the world. They have a tremendous economic interest in making sure all the data is exactly the same on all of these nodes. So for you to hack them, you would have to hack all of them simultaneously. You're not going to be able to go down to Janet Yellen and convince her to move the interest rates one way or the other to help your cause. This is not a group at the SEC that might have a lot of buddies that used to work at a former bank, and they sometimes have a revolving door between those roles, and people start to wonder whether the regulation is really an accelerant to corporate power, or whether it's in fact doing its job as a regulator. Who regulates the regulators when these things get overly centralized? Well, in the case of Bitcoin, the decentralization means there's no one to bribe, lobby, or coerce. You have to just earn your merit on the network according to your CPU cycles. So this thing has a heartbeat. This is how it works. Basically, every 10 minutes, you get millions of global transactions get pooled into a block, and this block is not officially part of the chain until some magic is done on it. And this magic is what I would call a cryptographic online Sudoku competition. Okay, so this is a process where all of these new blocks, if they want to be joined to the chain, they have to be cryptographically woven into that chain. And the way that weaving happens is through a hashing process where computers compete to solve a hash with an unknown set of characters added to it. So this is kind of like a Sudoku puzzle, where the numbers of rows and columns can be dynamically extended according to how many computers are competing on the problem. So if, let's say, a block happens to be solved in 15 minutes, the computer code knows, okay, make it a little easier, so we try and aim for 10 minutes. And if it goes faster down to 6 minutes, it says, okay, the computer capacity of the network is now too high. We have to adjust the difficulty, add some rows and columns to the Sudoku puzzle, and see if they can solve the problem. And the first one who does gets a reward. Now, the reason the Sudoku analogy is used in here, it's not exactly what's going on, but the reason the analogy resonates with a lot of people is that this is an algorithm with a particular characteristic, that it is difficult to solve but easy to verify. Sudoku puzzles can take a long time to solve, but you just check the rows and columns that they add up, and you know that, and you can verify them very quickly. That's incredibly important for the game theoretics of the network. The moment the first person finds a solution, all of the other miners on the network confirm that that solution is correct, and since it's easy to verify, they quickly move on to mining the next block because the next reward, the existing reward they're working on has already been claimed. They have to go now compute the next one. Now, the reward is very important. The reward right now is 12.5 Bitcoins, which happens to be about 60 grand every 10 minutes that are being handed out for this prize. This reward means lots of computers want to try and earn that 60 grand, and they all compete in what is known to be a mathematical problem that's fairly random. The computer which first hits this is not intelligently coded in any way. It's just really who can crunch the most amount of flip as many bits as possible on highly designed chips to get to the answer first. And there's a tremendous amount of luck involved. Nevertheless, if you do this enough, you'll get lucky enough, and on average, miners can predict their earnings and their profitability based on how many of these block rewards that they're going to recover in any given day. So this creates a tremendous amount of incentive for the miners to continually mine, and it also means that every single block that's been mined, that it was mined at this particular timestamp. you probably know you can estimate the cost of the energy at that time that went into mining that block, the amount of CPU cycles, you know the difficulty that was involved, in other words, how big the Sudoku puzzle was. So every block is kind of etched with this information about, well, this one required so many watts of energy to produce, and if you wanted to remake this block and change it, well, you've got all these other computers in the network that don't want to replicate a different block. They've all agreed on what that block is. It's been replicated all over the network. And so this becomes very difficult to hack. In fact, if you wanted to go back, let's say 10 or 20 blocks to change a value and redirect $1 million toward you instead of somebody else, you'd have to recompute all of those 10 blocks faster than the entire network can do the next 10 minutes. And that's what's really built into the security of this thing, is that there isn't enough compute power on Earth to actually race this thing. And if you had that compute power, you'd probably be better off just mining Bitcoin and earning some real money. So this kind of aligns people's interests and creates what they call a game theoretic to keep miners rewarded for bringing internet consistency and consensus on a ledger. It's called a distributed consensus algorithm. So this, you have to step back and realize this disrupts all industries. Just because it is a source of money now that's trading for probably about $70 billion, bigger than PayPal and Netflix, and growing much faster than both of those companies, you realize once you can do this, you can move stocks, and you don't need a NASDAQ. You don't need a centralized rehypothecation center that might be doing escrows and all of these stock market transactions. Money suddenly becomes an app. It's not a central bank. 2 to 3 billion people that are unbanked today will be coming into the economy shortly because they just need a $25 cell phone to get banked, much cheaper than their previous hurdles. There's $600 billion of remittances that move across borders. These are people who move out of their country and want to send money home. Well, all that goes through channels right now that are incredibly slow and take 10 to 20% of the money. You can do this through Bitcoin with very low fees. And this has also led to the largest global Kickstarter in history with the ICO market. These are initial coin offerings. People are now issuing their own crypto coins for their companies so that people can buy those and liquidate those much faster than you can buy or liquidate traditional private investment vehicles like private company stocks. This also becomes a form of scarcity for digital content. If you have cryptographic keys on content, then you can move music around like this and not have to worry about pirating. There are land titles that are going onto the blockchain, stocks, media, IP, voting, and smart contracts. Smart contracts are pieces of code that you can put in certain blockchains that are self-executable, and as a result, these can trigger other things to own cars and pay for cars. You can imagine cars actually owning bitcoins and being able to, if they can drive themselves, they can become emancipated taxi cabs that figure out how to pay for their own maintenance and etc. These days are coming with now that money is no longer tied to a person. It can actually be tied to any given thing that can code. So this really redefines our understanding of money and peer-to-peer economies. So we mentioned IP in here. So what does this have to do with cannabis? Well, cannabis has a lot of these cannabis patents that are emerging right now, and there's this big nasty strain name game where no one believes what strain is what. So you go into a dispensary and you don't see the typical spreads that you might see in a liquor store where you can have a $100 bottle of wine or a $10 bottle of wine. You don't get those spreads in cannabis dispensaries because nobody actually believes the labeling systems. And they shouldn't, because if you do any DNA sequencing in the space, you'll realize it's all made up. And there's very little consistency between people who claim one strain is some marquee strain. Well, quickly thereafter, people just start relabeling other strains to the strain that captures a little bit more money, and it self-equilibrates in the marketplace. So we don't have really good tools for proving that a trademark or a given strain is what it is. And we know with wider legalization, the tools of traditionally doing this will be utilized, and they are. We're seeing cannabis patents emerge, and many more have emerged since this one. There's one for equatorial sativa line, that even this patent has gotten even broader. And so these days are coming. So what do you do? Lots of cannabis patents are emerging, and you don't have the cash to necessarily play the game of the gamble of $100,000 patents. a lot of people look for defensive IP, which is exponentially cheaper and probably more effective. You'll see this in a lot of companies like Twitter and in companies like Tesla. They are making different positions with their IP because the cost of IP these days is kind of escalating, yet its longevity is kind of decaying. Patents sometimes take 32 months to issue, and sometimes your patent's extinct before the time that it's up. So defensive IP seems to be another alternative. People who use our tools here use both, but nevertheless, there is something in the plant patent statute known as a prior use exemption clause. So if you have proof of business use 1 year before the patent has issued, this is like a grandfather clause. So you can basically demonstrate that, hey, I've been using this in a business setting. Your patent that just submarined on me doesn't apply to me because I have proof of prior use. So how do you get that? Do you leafly and a picture on the internet? It's not going to do it. You really need to get this thing notarized. Federal banks are probably not a good place to go and get this notarized, and I wouldn't suggest putting this in necessarily federal databases either, because those have been known to be shut down whenever the government has a budget crisis. You'll notice the first things they turn off are the things that people love, like the Library of Medicine and the national parks. Those things are the first thing ripped away from the people, as opposed to the all types of the military industrial things that are being burnt that no one has any visibility on. No, those won't stop, but yeah, we'll take away the goods. So those databases we've seen disappear. This brings blockchains into picture, saying, why don't we store this information on this global ledger that is immutable and can't be taken down, and has a $140 billion network of trust that's increasingly growing. So that's what we do with StrainSEEK. We have a genetic profile. It's recorded with a permanent time-stamped blockchain record. It's disaster-proof. Its credentials can be given to the customer. This provides legal proof of prior existence and enables prior use exemption for submarine patents that are coming down the way. And just to contrast this with how we used to do things, the old way of doing things, well, we were always worried about the asymmetric cost of invalidating a patent. It tends to fall on the entrepreneur in that if you want to re-examine a patent, you're probably going to spend $100,000 or more in an ex parte re-examination. And this happens all the time, where bunk patents get issued and remain unchallenged because it's cheaper to pay off the troll than it is to pay the lawyers to do the invalidation process. All right, so you also have to keep in mind that humankind is doubling all of human data every 4 months. And so having a centralized agency like the USPTO trying to keep up with all of the existing information that's in terms of prior art, this is a very difficult problem, and they are notorious at not being incentivized to do it correctly. If they make mistakes, you're still filing them paperwork to reverse those mistakes. They don't pay for the mistakes, you do. So the incentives aren't aligned correctly here, and so as a result, we get lots of patents that issue that are bogus that you then have to dance around as a small entity, or come up with a defensive IP strategy, which is oftentimes more effective and cheaper. And the way we did this back in 2011, which had we known about Bitcoin, we would have probably done it differently, but at the time we weren't well aware of it, is we just filed a provisional patent to the USPTO, so they have it on record and they can't miss it in a preliminary search report, and then abandon the patent so we don't have to pay for the rest of the expenses of trying to get it to have a questionable patent on genes being public. We said, all right, forget it, let's make it an open market here and have freedom to operate. This can be much cheaper than having to prosecute a patent all the way into existence and then figure out how to actually police that patent into a somewhat gray market. So the old way of doing things would cost us more than $200,000 in sequencing costs and probably more than $20,000 in legal fees, and resulted in an abandoned patent on the cannabis genome, so that high THC strains should be in the open domain here on forward. Now, how do we do this today? Well, we've gotten this down to be only $500 in sequencing costs and $50 in a Bitcoin transaction fee. So this is a 400x improvement getting cannabis proof of existence completed. And we can now automate this and do this for everybody, so that your strains end up being public and defendable, and you have proof of prior use sitting on with a link to the blockchain. Now, we always encourage people to download their own data so that you replicate our version of this data. Yes, we have the timestamps in the blockchain. We cannot fit the entire DNA sequence profile in the blockchain because it's too much data. We just have a hash digest of that data. And so you have to keep the source of that hash has to get distributed and kept safe. And so that's on the customer. They take those VCF files and store them in other places. I'd recommend IPFS and other types of encrypted distributed data stores. But nevertheless, the hash is replicated all over the world, and that is what your file will always produce when you run SHA-256 on it, and that's in the blockchain. The other thing we do is we sequence 25 times more sequence than any other sequence provider out there. We sequence 3.2 million bases. This is an important number to ask because if it's a very low number of bases they're sequencing, well, you really don't know whether something's unique. So more bases the better. Eventually this will be whole genome shotgun. You get about 50,000 SNPs out of it. We also tile 34 cannabinoid and terpene genes in the process, and we run this Rosetta Stone SNP panel so that you can triangulate our data with everything else that's been put public to date. So MGC, which is Medicinal Genomics, Soiler, and Lynch, and Phylos have all put hundreds of strains public, but none of them have sequenced them with the same methods, and so none of that data can be cross-compared. The only thing that can cross-compare them is this Rosetta Stone that we've built, which sequences hundreds of SNPs across all of the same loci that they've all published before, and so now we can uniquely place something in the tree. No one else can do this. If they're sequencing for you, they don't know whether their stuff is unique in our database and whether it is unique in all the other public databases. So they're just giving you a sense that you're unique based on their own private database, and this is no longer going to remain private. This whole field is going to go blockchain, and it's going to be public, and there'll be distributed ledgers of cannabis, IP, and genetics circulating. We've been doing this for several years, and there's already hundreds and hundreds of strains that have been fingerprinted into the blockchain. This also gives you a relationship to all the other samples out there. It may teach you what things to breed with. It gives you this indelible timestamp, and you get a nice page published at Cannapedia to show off your strain with all the cannabinoid and terpene profile information hosted there with the blockchain information. So if you want to learn more about these types of things, please join us at CanMed. We're always intersecting these wild and different fields with the cannabis field. So, with that, please leave any comments or questions below, and we will get to them as we can. Thank you.